It wasn't gunfire that stopped the American advance in Italy. It was rain. Trucks rusted faster than they could roll, engines locked. Convoys died on roads of red mud. And for a moment, the greatest army in the world was beaten by weather. Then, from the back of a motor pool, a quiet farm boy began boiling something in an old metal tin. Soap, oil, and a secret his father once used to keep plows from rotting. Officers laughed. Soldiers called it nonsense. But when every other truck turned to rust, his rolled through the storm, shining like new. No one understood how. He didn't either. All he said was, "It's just soap, sir." By the time the war ended, that crazy soap mix had saved more than 20,000 vehicles. And maybe the war itself. A farmer's trick, a forgotten barrel, and the day rust lost to a man with a bucket. Behind every victory were men and women whose names never made the headlines. Their small ideas kept armies moving and changed the course of war. Yet history forgot them. Subscribe to hear their stories and keep their memory alive. Southern Italy, winter of 1943. The rain never stops. It falls in sheets that blur the horizon, pounding the roads into rivers of brown sludge. Tires sink, axles grind, 100 trucks crawl forward, engines growling like wounded animals. Each mile feels heavier than the last. The men have stopped talking. They drive with their jaws clenched, squinting through fogged windshields while water seeps through their boots. Canvas covers sag under the weight of endless rain. Every metal edge is slick, every bolt dark with moisture. By noon, the first truck dies. Its engine lets out a cough, then silence. A mechanic jumps down, opens the hood, and swears. The components are coated in rust, the color of dried blood, spreading across the steel like a disease. They try to crank it again. Nothing. Another truck behind it stalls, then another. Soon, the entire line stands still. Hundreds of tons of machinery, eaten alive by the weather. The mud sucks at their boots as men drag chains through the sludge, trying to tow dead trucks aside. One snaps clean in half, brittle with corrosion. They strip it for usable parts, toss the rest into the ditch, and move on. By evening, the road is lined with wrecks. Once sleek vehicles now resemble skeletons, frames hollowed by rot, headlights clouded like old eyes. The convoy limps forward with fewer and fewer survivors. Inside a tent at the roadside, mechanics scrape away rust with pocket knives and spoons. The sound is unbearable, a slow metallic rasp echoing through the rain. They have no proper chemicals left, no fresh grease, no dry rags, just bare hands, soaked uniforms, and frustration. One sergeant, drenched to the bone, throws down his wrench. "The Germans don't need to stop us," he mutters. "The damn weather's doing it for them." Outside, another truck sinks halfway into a flooded rut. Men shout, push, curse the sky. The rain only grows, louder. At the edge of the camp, a young corporal watches in silence. His name is Edwin Carter. He's small, broad-shouldered, face marked with grease and exhaustion. But there's something different in his eyes, not despair but recognition. He stares at the rust spreading across a truck's fender, watching water bead and run along its surface. Then he looks down at his hands, calloused, cracked, still faintly smelling of lye and oil, the same scent that once filled his father's barn, back home in Ohio. He's seen metal rot like this before, same damp, same orange scabs, spreading through the grain of the steel. Back then, his father had a way to stop it. Carter wipes the rain from his face, his mind turning not to the war, but to the memory of an old wooden barrel steaming in winter air, filled with soap, animal fat, and smoke from a farm fire. While others curse the weather, he's thinking of home, and of something that might just work. Edwin Carter hadn't meant to end up in a war. He'd grown up in the wide stillness of Ohio, where the land rolled in soft waves, and winters came heavy with silence. Most mornings began before sunrise, feeding the livestock, tightening bolts on the tractor, scraping frost from old plow blades. His father believed a good day started with clean hands and an oiled tool, and Carter grew up knowing the smell of lard and ash better than any perfume. Each winter, they made soap, not for bathing, but for keeping the world from rusting. His father would melt down fat in a dented iron pot, stir in ash from the wood stove, and pour the mixture into wooden molds. When it cooled, it was hard as stone, ugly, gray, slick with oil. They called it farm soap, though it was more shield than cleanser. Every spade, chain, and gear coated with it stayed new for years. Rain slid off like it feared to touch. Now, 10 years later, Carter kneels in a motor pool halfway across the world. Instead of wheat fields, there's mud and diesel fumes. Instead of barn walls, the horizon is filled with wrecked vehicles and the low thunder of artillery far beyond the hills. He wipes his hands on a rag, but the grease never leaves his skin. He's been a mechanic since the invasion of Sicily, part of the endless wave of men tasked with keeping the wheels of war turning. They've been fighting rust for months, and losing. Supplies promised from command never arrived. The cans of corrosion inhibitor are long empty, the spare grease rationed to tanks first. The trucks, the jeeps, the lifelines of the front are left to decay in rain that never ends. Carter watches a fellow mechanic pry at a rusted bolt with a crowbar until it snaps clean off. No one swears anymore. They're too tired for anger. It's just another failure among thousands. He remembers his father's hands, cracked, strong, blackened with soot, rubbing soap, over a shovel head. The image flickers, almost absurd against the backdrop of war. Still, the thought lingers. If that mix could keep a plow from rusting through endless Ohio winters, maybe it could keep a truck alive through an Italian one. That night, while others drink coffee and curse the weather, Carter goes to the scrap pile behind the tents. He rummages through discarded tins, half-empty oil cans, and broken brushes. He finds a dented mess tin, a bar of army soap, and a jar of leftover motor grease. It's not much, but it's enough to try. When he asks Supply if he can requisition a few more bars of soap, the quartermaster raises an eyebrow. "What, you planning to take a bath, Carter?" He doesn't answer. They wouldn't understand anyway. Later, as the rain drums on the tent roof, Carter lights a small fire under an overturned drum and starts melting the soap. The smell fills the camp, a sharp, sour blend of oil and smoke that draws groans from nearby bunks. Someone shouts for him to put it out before the sergeant smells it. He pretends not to hear. He stirs the mixture with a screwdriver, watching it bubble and thicken into a murky gray paste. It looks wrong, smells worse, but he keeps going. There's no manual for what he's doing, just instinct and the memory of an old man stirring lye by lantern light. When the mixture starts to harden, he pours it into a mess tin and leaves it to cool. Outside, thunder rolls over the hills. The wind smells of iron and rain. Carter wipes his hands on his trousers and stares at the trucks lined up in the darkness, metal carcasses gleaming with water. Tomorrow, he'll see if his father's old trick can survive a war. The next morning, Carter works before dawn. The camp still sleeps, blanketed in mist and the slow hiss of rain on canvas. He crouches beside the smoldering fire he built through the night, scraping the hardened mix from the bottom of his tin. The substance clings like tar, dull gray, sticky, stubborn. It doesn't look like salvation. It looks like failure. Still, he tests it. He dips a rag into the paste and wipes it across the fender of a rusted supply truck. The surface streaks with a greasy sheen, uneven and ugly. It smells like a mix of smoke, burnt oil, and soap scum, an odor so thick it makes him cough. He coats one truck completely, then a second, ignoring the laughter that starts behind him. "Carter's cooking breakfast again," someone yells. Another voice adds, "Looks like he's greasing pigs for inspection." He doesn't answer. He keeps working, spreading his strange mixture into every seam and joint, smearing it along bolts and panels until the rag falls apart in his hands. By afternoon, he's covered in soot and grime. The trucks glisten in the rain, slick but intact. He wipes his brow, satisfied in silence. No one joins him. A few men pass by, shaking their heads. To them, he's just another mechanic losing patience with the mud. Days pass. The rain doesn't stop. The roads churn deeper, and the smell of rot seeps into everything. Trucks begin to fail again, engines stuttering, metal flaking, bolts snapping under strain. Each morning brings another heap of corroded wrecks. But the two vehicles Carter coated remain solid. Their bolts turn smoothly, their frames hold strong. The difference is impossible to ignore. Soon, word reaches his sergeant. One afternoon, the officer walks over, coat dripping, boots thick with clay. "What's this nonsense you're spreading on government property?" he growls. "Just soap and oil, sir," Carter answers. The sergeant smirks. "You? You're greasing trucks like hogs and calling it maintenance?" Carter doesn't argue. He just nods toward the two machines behind him. They still run. The sergeant checks for himself, dragging a glove along the metal. No rust, none. He frowns, rubs harder, inspects his hand. It's clean, oily, but clean. The rest of the yard is corroded like a graveyard, but these two shine through the rain. The sergeant doesn't comment. He just leaves, muttering something about dumb luck. Encouraged, Carter mixes another batch. This time, he adds more grease, a touch of leftover motor oil, even the remains of an old candle. The camp reeks for a week. Soldiers curse the stench and nickname him Pig Soap Carter. Someone paints it on the side of one of his trucks. He takes it as a badge of honor. A week later, inspection day arrives. Rows of trucks stand ready, hoods open, engines roaring to life. The officers move down the line, noting failures one by one, fenders eaten away, hinges seized solid. But when they reach Carter's section, they pause. The vehicles coated in his strange paste gleam under the thin sun, their surfaces smooth and unscarred. An officer bends down, runs a hand along the wheel well, and stares at his glove. "No rust?" "Not yet, sir," Carter replies evenly. The officer sniffs the air, grimacing. "Smells like a soap factory. Better than a scrapyard," Carter says quietly. They move on without a word, but the whispers start. The men who mocked him now dip their rags into his leftover mixture, spreading it on their own equipment after dark. Soon, half the motor pool smells like lye and grease. No one admits to using it, but everyone knows where it came from. Within 2 weeks, the results are undeniable. Every truck treated with Carter's concoction stays intact. The rest continue to rot. Even the officers start asking questions. When command requests a sample for testing, Carter laughs under his breath. "You want the recipe?" he says. "Ask my father." No one knows if he's joking, but the joke spreads through the ranks faster than rust ever could. The rain didn't stop, but something had changed. The rust that once devoured every convoy began to retreat. Mechanics who once laughed now worked by firelight, stirring their own mixtures in ammo tins and ration pots, arguing over the ratios of oil to soap. One swore by bacon grease, another used leftover candle wax. Every version smelled different, but they all worked. Within weeks, the nickname stuck, Carter's Soap. It spread through the camps like a secret recipe. Soldiers passed tins of the gray paste from hand to hand, trading it like currency. A drop on a wrench, a swipe along a gear, a thin coat on exposed metal, and the rain simply rolled off. The mud roads were still endless, but trucks no longer rotted overnight. Paint stayed bright. Doors shut clean. Hinges moved without a groan. The motor pools, once graveyards of rust, began to hum again with steady engines. Carter didn't talk much about it. He still rose early, worked until night, and tested every batch himself. He didn't ask for credit. He only wanted to see the convoys move. But the story kept growing. Some swore his soap made even the oldest Jeeps look new again. Others joked that it could outlast paint. An officer from headquarters arrived one morning to investigate. He walked the length of the camp, pausing beside a row of trucks that gleamed in the wet sunlight. He scraped a knife across the fender, waiting to see flakes of rust fall. None did. The surface was clean, oily, smooth, almost alive. "What's in this?" he asked. "Soap and grease," Carter replied simply. The officer blinked, unsure if he was being mocked. "You mean you're painting trucks with kitchen scraps?" Carter wiped his hands on a rag. "With results, sir." The officer left, shaking his head, but by evening, orders had been sent to nearby units to replicate Corporal Carter's method. In 1 week, it reached the entire division. In 1 month, it was standard practice across 3 fronts. The supply officers even tried to issue guidelines, but every workshop had its own twist. Some used lard from the mess, others animal fat from local farms. One crew swore by adding a pinch of wood ash. It didn't matter. The essence was the same, and it worked. Letters home began to mention the miracle soap. Soldiers wrote to wives, brothers, and parents about how some farm kid had beaten rust. The story changed with each telling. Sometimes Carter was from Texas, sometimes Kansas, but the idea stayed constant. A mechanic's crazy grease mix was saving the army. Carter himself didn't care who got the story right. When mail finally came through the flooded road, he sat in his tent, pencil in hand, and wrote to his father. "Remember that soap we used on the plow? I made it again. It's keeping trucks alive out here. The men call it Carter's soap." Weeks later, a reply came on worn paper, the handwriting shaky but familiar. "Told you it was good soap." Carter smiled, folded the note, and tucked it into his breast pocket. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but it no longer felt like the enemy. The convoys rolled again, engines strong, steel unyielding. And somewhere in the storm, a farmer's son realized he'd turned a boyhood chore into a weapon against time itself. By early 1944, the story of Carter's soap had outgrown rumor. Command wanted proof. Not tales from the field, not jokes about a farmhand's miracle paste. Proof. Samples from multiple units were shipped to Allied chemical labs in Naples and Algiers. Scientists in white coats studied the gray residue under microscopes, testing it against water, salt, and acid. The results were immediate and undeniable. The mixture, crude as it looked, left behind a microscopic barrier of oil and alkali that clung to metal even under constant rain. Moisture couldn't penetrate it. Oxidation stopped entirely. One report described it as a hydrophobic protective film. Carter would have just called it soap doing its job. The discovery reached Logistics Command within a week. The reaction was swift and pragmatic. No speeches, no ceremony, just an order stamped in red. Adopt field-proven compound for corrosion prevention. Provisional designation, soap oil solution. Workshops across Italy and North Africa received new instructions. Barrels of fat, soap powder, and oil were requisitioned alongside ammunition. Motor pools began producing the mixture in bulk, labeling the drums with stenciled markings. Carter Compound. What started as a campfire experiment became standard procedure. Manuals were rewritten, adding a new line under maintenance. Apply corrosion film to exposed metal surfaces daily in wet conditions. No one needed to explain where the idea came from. Every mechanic already knew. Carter read the official memo posted to the motor pool wall. His name wasn't on it, but he smiled anyway. Recognition wasn't the point. The convoys were moving again. As winter turned to spring, the scope of the change became visible. Supply routes that once failed weekly now ran uninterrupted. Trucks coated in the mix crossed rivers, mountains, and coastal airfields without seizing or shedding paint. Out in France, where the invasion force gathered, engineers reported that vehicles treated with the soap compound resisted the salt air that had corroded every previous shipment. In Burma, under monsoon skies, tank crews mixed their own batches using whatever oil and soap they could find. They coated treads, hatches, and bolts, discovering that their armor could finally endure weeks of jungle humidity without falling apart. Across every front, the same quiet ritual repeated: fire, tin, oil, soap, stir, spread. No one called it innovation. It was simply survival, refined. For Carter, it was strange to see his invention become doctrine. Once a mockery, it was now an essential part of the war machine. Officers referenced it in briefings. Mechanics swore by it. The same men who had laughed now sought his opinion on ratios and mixtures. He never corrected them. He only reminded them to keep the layer thin, to rub it in deep, and to never let water sit long on metal. By the time Allied forces advanced through France, The formula had become as common as fuel or rations. The war had no shortage of new weapons or grand inventions, but few were as quietly effective as that ugly gray paste. The armies moved forward on engines that should have died months earlier. Bridges held. Convoys stayed mobile. And somewhere behind the lines, Carter worked at his bench, hands steady, stirring another pot of his father's legacy while the world turned on wheels he had saved. By the final year of the war, Carter's creation had become invisible, so common that no one thought to question where it came from. Yet its mark was everywhere. Convoys that once stalled after a week now thundered across Europe through snow, mud, and salt without slowing. Supply trucks braved storms that would have destroyed them months before. Engines still humming, steel shining beneath layers of grime. Reports arriving at headquarters spoke the same quiet truth. The rust problem was gone. Mechanics logged fewer failures. Spare parts lasted longer. The flow of supplies, fuel, rations, ammunition, moved like blood through the body of the Allied advance. Behind the lines, Carter's mixture was the silent pulse keeping it alive. In Normandy, coated landing vehicles rolled straight from the beaches to the hedgerows, their frames intact despite salt water that had ruined generations of ships. In the Italian hills, trucks climbed serpentine roads slick with rain, their engines protected by the dull, oily armor of Carter's soap. Farther east, in the frozen roads of the Ardennes, crews warmed their hands over fires made from the same barrels that held his compound. They joked that the army ran on fuel and farm grease. No one in those convoys ever met the man who'd made it possible. They only knew their equipment lasted, and that was enough. But somewhere in the maintenance archives, among dull tables of figures and part numbers, a single note appeared. Field Rust Prevention Procedure, adapted from Corporal E. Carter. It was buried between logistics records, barely noticed, but its impact measured in the miles traveled and battles sustained. 20,000 vehicles kept alive, not by factories or scientists, but by one man's stubborn memory of home. Carter never heard about the report. By then he was still in the field, repairing transmissions and teaching new recruits how to mix the compound correctly. When they asked where he'd learned it, he'd simply say, "My father." He never sought recognition, never wrote his name on a formula, never claimed to have changed anything. Yet every truck that reached the front, every tank that survived another storm, carried a trace of his handiwork. When victory came, and the roads filled with columns of vehicles rolling toward peace, Carter stood beside a convoy and watched them pass. Their metal caught the sunlight in a dull silver glow, each surface smooth and untarnished. It wasn't glory that filled him, only quiet relief. The machines had made it. The men inside them had made it. That was enough. He wiped his hands on a rag, looked at the smear of soap and oil on his palms, and smiled faintly. The war had been fought with weapons far greater than his, but none had lasted longer. No medal, no applause, just a legacy written in steel that refused to die. When the fighting ended, Carter packed his duffel, turned in his tools, and boarded a train heading west. The war had swallowed years of his life, but as the fields of Ohio came back into view, it felt as if time had never moved at all. The same fences bordered the same roads. The same barn leaned in the same wind. Even the smell, fresh hay and distant rain, was unchanged. He stepped off the truck that dropped him near the farmhouse and stood for a moment, watching the land. The silence was heavier than he remembered. No engines, no orders, no rain on canvas, just the soft hum of crickets in the grass. His father's old barrels still sat beside the barn, rust creeping across their rims. He ran a hand over one and felt the familiar roughness beneath his palm. Inside, his tools hung where he'd left them. A cracked wooden table, an empty tin, a faint trace of soap clinging to the corners. Out of habit, he gathered what little fat and lye remained, lit the stove, and began to stir. The rhythm was the same as before the war. Slow circles, steady motion, no hurry. The mixture bubbled, filling the room with the same harsh, earthy scent that had followed him across continents. Neighbors stopped by in the weeks that followed, curious about his time overseas. They asked if he'd seen combat, if he'd driven tanks, if he'd been near the front. Carter only smiled and said, "I kept the trucks clean." They laughed, thinking he was joking. He let them. As months passed, he repaired tractors, mended fences, and went back to the simple work of keeping things running. The war faded into memory, but its echo lingered in the grease beneath his nails and the steady rhythm of his hands. Years later, long after his name had vanished from paperwork and his file collected dust in a government archive, engineers studying corrosion-resistant coatings traced their origins back to a wartime maintenance formula, one first used by a corporal named Edwin Carter. His soap, they realized, had been the foundation for modern rust-proofing compounds used in every major industry after the war. But Carter never knew. He never sought out recognition, never claimed a legacy. To him, it had all been simple: a problem, a solution, and a habit learned from his father. He lived quietly, fixing machines until his hands grew too weak to hold a wrench. When he passed, there were no speeches, no headlines, just a modest funeral attended by family, a few neighbors, and one old mechanic who'd once served with him. They buried him under an oak tree at the edge of the farm, where rain still tapped softly against the soil. If rust touched his headstone, it didn't last long. Someone, maybe his son, maybe an old friend, had rubbed it clean and left a faint sheen of oil over the letters. Because of him, an army had moved when it should have stopped. Because of him, the wheels of victory had kept turning. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of machines still running decades later, a trace of his soap remained. History rarely pauses for men like Edwin Carter. It remembers the battles, the generals, the flags in the wind, never the hands that kept the engines alive. Yet wars are not won only by bullets and strategy. Some are fought in silence, in the shadows of workshops and motor pools, with nothing more than faith, sweat, and a stubborn idea. In 1943, rust nearly defeated an army. Rain corroded steel faster than any weapon could destroy it. Convoys died before reaching the front. The great machine of war faltered, until a farm boy from Ohio stirred together soap, oil, and memory. What he made was simple. What it did was extraordinary. That crazy mix held back decay, carried supplies through storms, and kept the lifelines of victory moving. No medals marked his name, no monument bore his face. But his creation lived on, in every engine that endured, in every machine that refused to break, in every soldier who reached the fight because the wheels still turned. Some heroes carry rifles, others carry wrenches, and sometimes the smallest war, the war against rust, is the one that keeps the world from stopping. This was the story of Corporal Edwin Carter, the farmer who turned soap into strength and helped an army roll toward victory. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes true heroes go unnoticed. And tell us in the comments, what other forgotten stories from the war deserve to be remembered? Subscribe so you never miss the next untold chapter of history.